Hello, and welcome to Soulspeak, a place where stories are told, not just to be remembered, but to be understood. Here, we don't chase horror for shock. We trace it back to the quiet moments that made it possible, the silence, the choices, the small cruelties that grow in the dark. Because sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. They're living right next door. They called it the most terrible crime ever committed in the state of Indiana. For 3 long months, a 16-year-old girl was beaten, burned, and starved. Not by strangers, but inside a neighbor's home. A house filled with children, laughter, and Sunday prayers. What makes this story horrifying isn't just what was done to her, it's how many people knew and stayed silent. This is the story of Sylvia Likens and the house that turned silence into a weapon. Asterisk, there are stories that do not need gunfire or blood to terrify a nation. Sometimes, silence itself is the killer. In the summer of 1965, that silence lived on a quiet street in Indianapolis, Indiana, a silence so deep, so ordinary, that no one thought to question it until it was far too late. The neighborhood looked like a photograph from an old magazine. White painted houses lined the road, their porches heavy with the scent of heat and dust. Lawns were neatly trimmed, flags fluttered from wooden poles, and children coasted down the sidewalks on their bicycles. The air was thick with the whir of sprinklers and the sound of summer dogs barking, radios humming, the soft clatter of dishes from kitchen windows. It was the very image of the American dream. At 3850 East New York Street stood a narrow 2-story home with peeling paint and a tired front porch. Inside that house, behind drawn curtains, 16-year-old Sylvia Likens was dying. There were no gunshots, no knives, no intruders in the night. There were only bruises, burns, hunger, shame, and silence. The silence began small, like a whisper ignored. Sylvia's parents, carnival workers named Lester and Betty Likens, had left her and her younger sister Jenny in the care of a woman named Gertrude Banaszewski while they traveled with the carnival. The arrangement seemed harmless, $20 a week for room and board, 2 girls staying in a respectable home with a mother and her children. The Likens family didn't know that the woman they trusted was sick, exhausted, and quietly unraveling under the weight of her own bitterness. For the first few days, everything appeared normal. Sylvia helped around the house, played with Gertrude's daughters, went to church. She was polite, shy, soft-spoken, the kind of girl who smiled when she was nervous. But when the weekly payment from her parents arrived late, Gertrude's tone shifted. She began to scold Sylvia for things she hadn't done, for being lazy, for lying, for flirting with boys. Her anger came like a storm breaking open, sudden and unpredictable. A slap here, a shouted insult there, then came the others. Gertrude's children, Paula, Stephanie, John Jr., and the younger ones began to watch how their mother treated Sylvia, and they followed her lead. The neighborhood kids joined in too, boys from down the street, drawn by curiosity and cruelty. At first they only mocked her, teasing her about imaginary scenes Gertrude invented, but the games turned darker, the laughter sharper. And through it all, the silence grew. People in the neighborhood heard things, thuds, shouts, a girl's voice crying behind the walls. Someone once saw Sylvia's bruised legs when she took out the trash. Another saw her limping. A few wondered, quietly, what was happening in that house. But no one knocked on the door. No one called the police. It was the kind of silence that seeps into everything. The kind that feels justified because it hides behind politeness. In 1960s America, people minded their own business. They believed family matters belonged inside the family. And so, when a child screamed behind closed curtains, neighbors turned up the radio. By October, that silence had become a grave. Sylvia had grown thin and pale, her hair dull, her voice hoarse from crying. She was no longer allowed to sleep in a bed. She was forced into the basement, a cold, dark space where she was left for days. The children upstairs could hear her begging for water. Sometimes, they laughed. Sometimes, they said nothing. But this isn't the part where Sylvia dies, not yet. This is the part where the world outside keeps turning, pretending not to notice. The mailman delivers letters. The ice cream truck drives by. Teachers mark attendance sheets and wonder why Sylvia has missed so many days. Each small act of indifference builds a wall higher around her. Gertrude, meanwhile, had turned cruelty into a routine. She told the children Sylvia was a bad girl, that she had disgraced herself, that she deserved to be punished. She turned her delusion into a kind of ritual, a moral theater where the others played along, punishing Sylvia as if it made them righteous. And the more they did it, the less human she became in their eyes. This was not a crime born of passion. It was a slow, methodical erasure of a person, done not in secret, but in plain sight. Sylvia's screams faded into the rhythm of the neighborhood, like a sound people learned to ignore. When she finally collapsed in that house, bones bruised, skin burned, body broken, no one was there to hold her hand. Gertrude told the others to clean up. Someone called the police, pretending it was an accident. Outside, the air was still warm. Children were still playing. The world somehow went on. Later, when the truth came out, when police stepped into that basement and saw what had been done, America would gasp in horror. Newspapers would call it the most terrible crime ever committed in the state of Indiana. Reporters would write about evil, about madness, about the cruelty of one woman. But the real story, the one no one wanted to tell, was about everyone else, the people who lived just a few steps away, the ones who heard and did nothing, because the truth is, the death of Sylvia Likens wasn't just a murder, it was a mirror, a reflection of what happens when ordinary people stop caring, when neighbors stay silent, when society decides that someone else's pain is not their problem. In 1965, in a quiet corner of Indianapolis, America didn't just lose a girl, it lost a piece of its conscience. Her name was Gertrude Benishevsky, and to the outside world, she was nothing remarkable, a pale, frail woman in her late 30s, mother of 7 children, trying to survive in a house that seemed to collapse a little more each day. To most of her neighbors on East New York Street, she was simply Mrs. Benishevsky, the tired woman who always seemed to have a cigarette between her fingers and too many mouths to feed. She was the kind of person people pitied quietly but rarely helped. Gertrude's story, like most monsters, did not begin with evil. It began with exhaustion, the kind that seeps into your bones after years of being beaten down by life. She had married young, barely 16, to a police officer named John Benishevsky, a man who would later become her abuser. Over the course of 10 years, he broke her ribs, her confidence, and eventually her spirit. Each time she left him, she came back, carrying another child and a little less of herself. By her mid-30s, she had 7 children, a failing body, and a face that had forgotten how to smile. When John finally left for good, he took everything, not just the money, but the stability she had clung to, even in misery. Gertrude drifted through a series of relationships, most with younger men who used her and left her. She suffered from chronic bronchitis, depression, and malnutrition, and there were days when she barely ate so her children could. Life had made her brittle. Every breath felt like a debt unpaid. In another story, perhaps, she might have been pitied, but in this one, her pain didn't soften her, it curdled. The bitterness inside her began to take shape, feeding on her envy of everything she could no longer be. Youth, beauty, freedom. Those words became sharp edges in her mind. She looked at the world and saw only reminders of what it had stolen from her when the Likens sisters came into her home in the summer of 1965. They walked straight into that bitterness. Sylvia and Jenny Likens were polite, sweet girls, polite in the way children of poverty often are, cautious and grateful for any kindness. Their parents, Lester and Betty, had left them in Gertrude's care while traveling with a carnival. $20 a week was promised for food and shelter, a fair deal, it seemed. Gertrude needed the money desperately. Her own cupboards were nearly empty. Her children often went hungry. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Sylvia helped with chores. Jenny tried to fit in despite her leg brace. Gertrude smiled, offered them soup, told them they could call her Aunt Gertrude. But beneath that brittle kindness, something began to stir. Sylvia's youth was like sunlight creeping through cracks in a boarded window, gentle, unintentional, yet unbearable to someone who lived in darkness. Gertrude watched the girl and felt a kind of rage she couldn't explain. Sylvia was not rude or arrogant. She was kind, but that kindness, that innocence, made Gertrude feel the weight of everything she'd lost. Sylvia reminded her of herself before the bruises, before the cigarettes, before life had stripped her clean of softness. And so, what began as envy soon became obsession, the cruel kind that disguises itself as moral judgment. Gertrude started with words. She scolded Sylvia for being too proud, for showing off her looks. When the weekly payment from the Likens parents arrived late, her anger needed somewhere to land, and Sylvia was an easy target. The human mind, when warped by pain, looks for order in chaos, and for Gertrude, control over Sylvia became that order. She couldn't control her ex-husband, or the men who left her, or the world that forgot her. But she could control this girl. She could bend her. She could make her small. What makes Gertrude so terrifying is not that she snapped, but that she planned, justified, and taught. She weaponized motherhood, turning her own home into a small kingdom of cruelty where she reigned as judge and punisher. Her children watched, learned, obeyed. In her twisted logic, every insult, every blow, was a lesson. She wasn't hurting Sylvia, she told herself. She was teaching her not to be vain, not to be sinful, not to be like all the women who had disappointed men like John Banaszewski. Gertrude's house was filled with ghosts, not of the dead, but of the versions of herself she could never be again. Poverty clung to the air. There were stains on the carpet, dishes piled in the sink, the bitter smell of cigarette smoke soaked into the curtains. The children, half-starved and restless, ran in and out like stray animals. Sometimes there was laughter, sometimes screaming, often both. It was the kind of place where cruelty didn't need to be taught. It was inhaled like dust art by the time Sylvia arrived. Gertrude's sanity was already thin as glass. Years of neglect, humiliation, and despair had built a cage in her mind. Sylvia's presence, young, innocent, alive, rattled that cage until it broke. And when it did, what came out wasn't madness in the dramatic sense. It was something colder, quieter, a cruelty that believed itself righteous. There is a phrase psychologists use: moral disengagement, the ability to do harm while convincing oneself it's good. Gertrude mastered it. She turned her jealousy into morality. She began to speak about Sylvia's supposed sins, whispering them to her children until they believed. It was easier to call Sylvia wicked than to admit they were hungry, poor, and unloved. By condemning her, they could feel pure. And so, Gertrude became both prophet and warden of her own little world. She created rules, punishments, rituals of shame. The others followed, because in that house, power was survival and cruelty was currency. Each act of violence became a way to belong, to please her, to feel less helpless. What is most chilling about Gertrude Banaszewski is how ordinary she was. She wasn't a monster in the cinematic sense, not a deranged killer or a psychopath stalking victims. She was a neighbor, a mother, the woman you might pass on the street and never notice. Her evil wasn't born in chaos. It was built, layer by layer, out of neglect, resentment, and years of invisible suffering. The tragedy of Sylvia Likens is that she didn't walk into the home of a stranger. She walked into the home of a broken woman who had decided that if she couldn't have innocence, no one else would either. By late summer, the house on East New York Street had changed. The air inside was heavier. Gertrude's voice had grown sharper, her face thinner, her eyes sunken. The children had learned to move quietly, to read her moods like weather. Sylvia still smiled sometimes, perhaps believing that kindness could soften the woman. But kindness only made Gertrude angrier. It was a mirror she couldn't bear to look into. When people later tried to understand her, the psychologists, the reporters, the jurors, they asked the same question: why? Why would a woman, a mother, do this? Some said mental illness, others said poverty, exhaustion, moral decay. But the truth is more complicated. Gertrude Banaszewski wasn't insane in the clinical sense. She was lucid, deliberate, and aware. What drove her wasn't madness, it was meaning. In her mind, the world had taken everything. By destroying Sylvia, she was reclaiming control, rewriting her own humiliation into dominance. There is something profoundly unsettling about that kind of evil, the evil that doesn't roar but whispers, that wears the face of suffering, that convinces itself it's doing what's right. When Sylvia Likens stepped into that house in July of 1965, she could not have known that she was stepping into the mind of a woman who saw her not as a child, but as a reflection of everything she hated about her own life. To Gertrude, Sylvia was not a guest, she was a mirror, and before that summer ended, she would shatter it completely. By the time Sylvia Likens moved into the Banaszewski house, the storm inside Gertrude was already forming. Years of anger, illness, and quiet humiliation had hollowed her out, leaving only resentment and the need to control something or someone. Sylvia's kindness, her youth, her easy smile, they weren't virtues to Gertrude. They were provocations. Every laugh, every polite "yes ma'am," was a reminder of everything she'd lost. So when the first payment from Sylvia's parents arrived late, it wasn't just money that went missing. It was the last thread of patience Gertrude had left. And from that moment on, kindness would no longer be met with kindness, only with pain. It started quietly, not with screams, not with blood, but with a late payment. The first week the envelope from Lester and Betty Likens didn't arrive on time. Something in Gertrude Banaszewski shifted. Her irritation simmered into resentment, and resentment soon needed a target. The girls, Sylvia and her younger sister Jenny, were the only ones in reach. At first, it was just words. Sharp, bitter, heavy with disappointment that wasn't really meant for them. "You think money grows on trees?" she'd hiss, pacing the kitchen, cigarette trembling between her fingers. "You eat my food, You sleep under my roof, and your parents can't even pay on time. Sylvia would stand still, head lowered, hands clasped tightly in front of her, murmuring apologies she didn't owe. Jenny, the younger one with the leg brace, usually tried to fade into the background, shrinking behind her sister, but Gertrude's eyes always found Sylvia, the healthy one, the one who smiled too easily, who looked too much like the kind of girl the world used to let Gertrude be. A few days later, the first slap came. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even shouted. It was almost casual, a quick, open-handed strike across Sylvia's face that left a red mark and an echo in the silence afterward. Gertrude told her it was a lesson in respect. Then came more small punishments, each one framed as discipline: skipping a meal, scrubbing floors twice, standing in the corner until her knees ached. To the children in the house, Gertrude's sons and daughters, a pack of restless kids used to chaos, this was nothing new. Their mother yelled all the time, sometimes at them, sometimes at the air. But with Sylvia, the tone was different. There was focus in it, a coldness that wasn't there before. Gertrude's anger began to orbit the girl like gravity, pulling everyone else along. When the next week's payment came late again, Gertrude didn't shout. She laughed a dry, humorless sound and called Sylvia into the living room. "You're gonna pay me back," she said, motioning to the floor with her cigarette. "If your parents can't keep their word, you'll work it off." Sylvia nodded, unsure what that meant. She cleaned the house, washed the dishes, did laundry, helped with the younger children, but no matter how much she did, Gertrude found fault. A speck of dust on a table, a wrinkled shirt, the milk poured too full. Each mistake invited another slap, another insult. What began as discipline soon became something darker, a ritual. Gertrude had found a way to release her frustration, to turn her pain into authority. In a house where she had no power, no money, no health, no respect, Sylvia became the one thing she could control completely. At night, when the house grew quiet and the children finally slept, Sylvia could hear Gertrude coughing in the next room. The sound was rough, deep, dragging like something old and angry clawing its way out of her chest. Sometimes, between coughs, she would mutter to herself, "Ungrateful little thing, acting better than us." The next morning, the routine continued. The yelling, the chores, the punishments. Jenny would whisper, "Just stay quiet, Syl, don't make her mad." Sylvia would nod, always trying to stay polite, still believing that kindness might calm the woman. But kindness was gasoline to Gertrude's fire. The more Sylvia tried to please her, the more Gertrude seemed to despise her. Outside, the neighborhood went on as if nothing was wrong. The hum of lawnmowers, the laughter of children, the rustle of leaves in the summer air, all of it masking the tension inside that house. To anyone passing by, it looked like an ordinary home. No one saw the way Sylvia flinched when someone raised their voice, or how she hesitated before stepping into a room, unsure of what version of Gertrude would be waiting there. This was the beginning, small enough to ignore, quiet enough to seem like discipline, ordinary enough to be invisible. But cruelty, once given space to grow, never stays small. In that house, on that ordinary street, something had already begun to rot. And soon, the whole neighborhood would smell it. The violence didn't explode overnight. It crept slow, deliberate, like mold spreading through the corners of a house. By mid-August, the Bonashevsky home had begun to change. The shouting became routine, the air heavier, and the bruises on Sylvia's skin no longer faded before new ones appeared. What began as discipline had grown into entertainment, and the line between punishment and pleasure blurred completely. Gertrude's daughter Paula was the first to join in. 17, heavyset, and visibly pregnant by a married man. She carried her own quiet shame, and Sylvia became the perfect outlet. When Gertrude scolded Sylvia, Paula watched from across the room with cold fascination. At first, she laughed along. Later, she started striking the girl herself, each blow landing harder than the last. It wasn't just cruelty, it was relief. Paula's pregnancy made her desperate to redirect attention. If Sylvia could be painted as the bad girl, then Paula could remain the victim, the daughter led astray, not the one responsible. Gertrude fed this illusion, whispering lies to the younger children and neighbors, that Sylvia had been spreading rumors, that she was sleeping around, that she was dirty. Soon, the insults took on a rhythm, a purpose. "Slut, filthy, think you're better than us." Sylvia, too polite to answer, would lower her head, whispering, "No, ma'am," but silence didn't protect her. It only made them hungrier. By late summer, food had become another weapon. While Gertrude and her children ate, Sylvia was made to watch, her plate taken away, her stomach growling audibly in the thick air. When she begged for scraps, Gertrude would smile faintly and say, "You want food, you earn it." Sometimes, They'd let her have leftovers, but only after forcing her to perform, to do chores until her hands blistered, to clean floors already clean, to endure questions meant to humiliate. Tell everyone what you did, Paula would sneer. Tell them how dirty you are. Sylvia, crying, confused, denied it. I didn't do anything. That denial was proof enough. Gertrude nodded approvingly, and the room erupted in laughter. The cruelty soon became communal. The neighborhood kids, Coy Hubbard, Richard Hobbs, and others began coming by more often. The Benishevsky home, once a place of disorder, now had a dark gravitational pull. To the children of East New York Street, it was a house without rules, where laughter came from cruelty and adults didn't stop you. Gertrude didn't just allow it, she encouraged it. Teach her a lesson, she'd say, smiling through cigarette smoke. Show her what happens to girls like that. They obeyed. Sometimes they would hit Sylvia in front of everyone, just to make Gertrude laugh. Other times, they'd drag her out onto the porch, make her lift her skirt while neighbors passed by. Look at the little tramp, Gertrude would say. The humiliation burned deeper than any bruise. Gertrude's home had become a theater of pain. Every act of violence was a performance, each child trying to outdo the other to win her approval. And behind the laughter was a strange kind of unity. For the first time, they felt powerful. In a world that ignored them, poor, unwanted, invisible, here they were seen. Sylvia, meanwhile, learned the rhythm of survival. She spoke less, moved slower, tried to anticipate what would set them off. But no pattern could be found. One day she'd be hit for smiling, the next, for not smiling enough. Hunger hollowed her face, her collarbones sharp beneath her shirt. Her hair lost its shine, and her voice grew soft, almost childlike. The children noticed the change and mocked it. She looked scared all the time, one boy said. She should be, Paula replied. Gertrude's narrative spread beyond the house. To the few neighbors who asked, she said Sylvia had become wild, that she was running with boys, infecting others with her bad morals. It was easier for them to believe the lie than to imagine the truth. After all, what kind of mother would hurt a child under her roof? And so, the silence continued. Inside, the cruelty evolved. Paula once punched Sylvia so hard in the jaw that her knuckles split. She later bragged about it at school, laughing that Sylvia deserved it. Coy Hubbard, a neighborhood boy barely 15, took to practicing judo throws on her small body, while Gertrude watched like a coach correcting form. Not like that, she'd say. Throw her harder. Sometimes, when Sylvia tried to defend herself, Gertrude accused her of lying, of acting innocent. The accusations became stories, and the stories became truths inside that house. Soon, Sylvia wasn't a girl anymore. She was a symbol, an example of what happens to bad girls. The more Gertrude repeated it, the more everyone believed. One evening, she gathered the children in the living room. Sylvia stood in the center, trembling, her arms crossed over her stomach. You all know what she's been doing, Gertrude said, her voice low and certain. Sneaking around with boys, spreading lies, thinking she's better than us. We're going to teach her something tonight. What followed was no longer discipline, it was ritual humiliation. The children surrounded her, laughing, taunting, echoing their mother's words. Someone threw a book, another grabbed her hair. Sylvia fell to her knees, covering her face as Gertrude's voice rose above the noise. Look at her, tell me she doesn't deserve it. No one disagreed. The walls of 3850 East New York Street, already stained with cigarette smoke and neglect, now held something else. The sound of cruelty normalized, the kind that doesn't come from monsters, but from people who have forgotten how to feel. By September, Sylvia was barely recognizable. Thin, bruised, quieter than ever. Jenny, terrified and limping, tried to help her when she could. A glass of water at night. I whispered I'm sorry when no one heard. But Jenny was a prisoner too. She knew that if she spoke up she'd take Sylvia's place. In the outside world, life carried on. The mail was delivered. Children played. Church bells rang every Sunday. And in that same neighborhood, behind those same curtains, a 16-year-old girl was being erased piece by piece, day by day, by a house full of people who called it justice. By early autumn, the Benishevsky house had become something other than a home. It breathed cruelty. The curtains stayed drawn even in daylight, trapping the stale smell of smoke and fear. The laughter that once echoed through its rooms had turned into something thin and mean, a sound that fed on another person's suffering. Sylvia Likens had stopped hoping the nightmare would end. Her body had grown light, her thoughts slow and detached, as if she were watching herself from a distance. The punishments no longer surprised her. They arrived like weather, inevitable and senseless. What frightened her now was not the pain but the pattern. How easily ordinary moments became instruments of control. Gertrude ruled this world with the calm of someone who believed she was right. What had started as outbursts of rage was now ceremony. She decided when Sylvia could speak, when she could stand, when she could eat. Every word out of Gertrude's mouth was a verdict. Every nod from her gave permission to hurt. The children followed her cues. They had long since stopped asking why. Power had become a kind of drug, a way to feel big in a world that had always made them small. They learned that cruelty, when shared, felt lighter. That laughter could drown out guilt if you laughed hard enough. Neighbors still heard noises at odd hours, thumps, a muffled cry, but everyone convinced themselves it was nothing. The illusion of normalcy was easier to protect than the truth. As the weeks passed, the punishments grew stranger. They weren't about rules anymore. They were about ownership. Sylvia's name was used less and less. She was the girl, the lesson. Language stripped away her personhood long before the final violence did. Gertrude told anyone who listened that Sylvia was unclean, that she needed to be taught a woman's place. The lie gave moral shape to the cruelty. It made the horror feel like duty. Inside that collapsing house, a hierarchy of pain emerged. Gertrude commanded, Paula enforced, and the younger children carried out orders with the casual obedience of soldiers. Each day blurred into the next. Morning chores, shouted accusations, a crowd forming in the living room whenever their mother decided to make an example. The air smelled of stale food and cigarettes, the floor sticky from spilled drinks, the walls dented where anger had landed. By October, Sylvia rarely saw the sun. She was kept downstairs more often, a narrow, unfinished basement where the air was cold and damp, and light came only from a small window near the ceiling. Their time stretched differently. Hours merged into nights. Voices above became distant echoes. Sometimes she would hear children's footsteps running across the floorboards, followed by Gertrude's cough, that low, rattling sound that never seemed to end. It was the only rhythm in the house, the heartbeat of decay. Yet even in that basement, Sylvia tried to hold on to small pieces of herself. She whispered to Jenny when she could, telling her not to cry, promising that their parents would come soon. She still said please and thank you when someone handed her water, even if it was laced with mockery. It was her last act of defiance to remain gentle in a place built on hate. Gertrude couldn't stand that. There was something unbearable about kindness surviving in a space she'd already claimed as her own. So she tried to erase it completely. Her voice grew softer, almost tender, when she gave new orders, the way one might speak to a child about to learn a difficult lesson. Every command was a step toward dehumanization. Each correction was meant to prove that Sylvia's will no longer existed by then. The children upstairs spoke of the basement the way others might speak of a haunted room. Some bragged about being brave enough to go down there. Others said they'd heard Sylvia talking to herself, praying. To them she had become both victim and myth, a ghost still alive. And in Gertrude's mind, that was fitting. Ghosts didn't need food or warmth or mercy. They were reminders, not people. Outside, autumn arrived in Indianapolis. Leaves turned brown, the air cooled, and Halloween decorations appeared in windows. On East New York Street, everything looked perfectly ordinary. The house with the broken steps and drawn curtains blended into the row of others like it, one more tired. Building in a working-class neighborhood, no one realized it was already a mausoleum. Inside, Sylvia's world shrank to the size of a concrete floor and a single question that looped endlessly in her head. What did I do wrong? She never found an answer, because there wasn't one. Her suffering had stopped being personal. It had become symbolic, a performance that allowed everyone else to forget their own helplessness. Every act of cruelty against her was, in a warped way, an act of self-forgiveness for them. When Gertrude finally silenced her completely, the house fell quiet for the first time in months. The children ate dinner as if nothing had changed. Dishes clattered, someone laughed at a joke, and the world above resumed its rhythm. Down below, the silence was complete, a silence that would echo far beyond those walls. Days later, when the police entered 3850 East New York Street, they found evidence of everything that had been denied. The cold air of the basement, the marks of confinement, the signs of long neglect. It wasn't just a crime scene, it was the physical map of moral collapse. Every wall told the same story, how ordinary people, one decision at a time, can build their own hell. Reporters would later call it the House of Torture, but that title misses the deeper truth. This wasn't only a house of violence, it was a house of silence. Every person who laughed, who watched, who chose not to knock on the door, had laid a brick in it. And when it was finished, a 16-year-old girl was buried inside without a grave. After Sylvia's body was taken away, neighbors gathered on their porches, whispering in disbelief. They said the signs had been there, the sounds, the stories, the shadows in the window, but no one had thought it could be that bad. They used words like tragedy and madness because those words made it easier to sleep at night. They let people believe the horror was something exceptional, not something that had grown in the soil of their own indifference. In the days that followed, the house stood empty, windows boarded, its walls still smelling of smoke and damp. The laughter that once filled it was gone, replaced by a silence heavier than before, the silence of realization. On the street, children rode their bikes again, mothers hung laundry, men went to work. Life resumed, because it always does. But somewhere in that neighborhood's collective memory, the echo remained. The case of Sylvia Likens would later change laws, headlines, even history. Yet no legal reform could erase what the story revealed, that the worst horrors are not committed in dark alleys or distant battlefields, but in living rooms and basements, under roofs that look just like ours. The house on East New York Street was not an accident of evil, it was the result of 1,000 tiny silences, and for Sylvia Likens, silence was the last sound she ever heard. When the noise stopped inside 3850 East New York Street, the whole block exhaled. For months there had been shouting, quick bursts of laughter, the slam of a door, the strange thud that followed. Then, suddenly, nothing. The house seemed to sink into itself, and the quiet that replaced it was not peace, but aftermath. From the street, the Bonashevsky home looked no different from the others. The same flaking paint, the same tired porch steps, the same flag wilting in the wind. Yet everyone on that street carried a private knowledge, more fragments of sound, glimpses through windows, whispers passed over fences that, if pieced together, would have told the story of a girl being destroyed inside. No one ever put those pieces together, or perhaps they did, and then quietly took them apart again, convincing themselves it couldn't be true. A woman across the way remembered seeing Sylvia once in August, standing on the porch in a sleeveless blouse despite the bruises on her arms. She had meant to ask if the girl was all right, but she was late for work. Someone else will check, she had thought. A few days later, Sylvia disappeared from sight, and the woman's relief came disguised as certainty. Maybe the girl had gone back to her parents. It was easier that way. Another neighbor, an older man who mowed lawns for extra cash, had heard screaming one evening while sharpening his mower blades. He paused, looked toward the house, waited. The screams subsided. He told himself it was just kids rough. That lie held, because it was simple, because it asked nothing of him. Even the church wasn't untouched by the illusion. A local minister visited the Benashevsky home after Gertrude mentioned she was disciplining a wayward girl. He found Sylvia thin and pale, her eyes avoiding his. When he asked if everything was fine, Gertrude answered with a practiced sigh, "She's fallen into bad habits. We're trying to straighten her out." The minister nodded, offered a quick prayer, and left. He would later say that he had felt uneasy but had trusted a mother's word over a child's silence. It was like that everywhere. Small doubts, dismissed one by one. The grocery clerk who noticed Gertrude buying less food despite the number of mouths to feed. The mailman who wondered why the envelope from the Likens family had stopped arriving. The teacher who marked Jenny absent and decided not to call home. A dozen tiny moments where conscience might have spoken but did in single quotes. Collectively, these omissions built the same prison Sylvia lived in. Each unmade phone call, each averted glance, added another brick to the wall of her isolation. The cruelty inside the house was Gertrude's, but the echo that sustained it belonged to everyone else. On that block, silence became routine. Children still played hopscotch on cracked sidewalks. Men still leaned against fences, trading gossip about the Colts. Mothers still hung laundry in the pale autumn sun. They heard rumors, something about a foster girl, a bit of trouble, a family matter best left alone. In neighborhoods like that, reputation was oxygen. To accuse someone of abuse was to risk suffocating in gossip. So people minded their business. They always did. When the police finally entered the house in late October, carrying notebooks instead of weapons, the illusion shattered. The scene they found was incomprehensible, and for the first time in months, the neighborhood gathered not to help, but to stare. Reporters came, cameras flashed, and everyone wanted to say they had suspected something. The woman across the street cried on her porch, insisting she had almost called. The lawnmower man shook his head, saying he'd heard nothing clear. The minister prayed louder than ever. The silence that had once protected them now sounded like guilt. In court later, witnesses tried to explain themselves. They spoke about fear of getting involved, about not wanting to believe such evil could exist so near. Each statement was a confession of convenience, an admission that comfort had outweighed courage. What no one admitted aloud was that Sylvia's suffering had been visible precisely because it was ordinary. A thin girl, a strict guardian, a bit of yelling, nothing that didn't happen somewhere every day. That ordinariness was the real weapon. It dulled empathy, made atrocity look domestic. It taught an entire community that as long as the curtains stayed closed, they could still call themselves good. The silence was contagious. Even after the trial, when details filled the newspapers, neighbors avoided each other's eyes. No one wanted to discuss who had heard what. The memory of that house lingered like smoke, but people moved on quickly. New families rented the property. Children played again in the yard. The address changed hands, but its shadow never left. For the survivors, the children who had participated, the siblings who had watched silence, became inheritance. Some denied everything. Others rationalized. They said they were too young, too scared, too influenced by Gertrude's authority. All of it true, in part. Yet beneath those explanations lay the same truth that haunted the entire street. Knowing and doing nothing are never separate acts. When journalists revisited East New York Street years later, they found a neighborhood eager to forget. One former neighbor, now gray-haired, said softly, "We just didn't think something like that could happen here." She paused, then added, "That's the thing, it did happen here." Her voice cracked on the last word, as if saying it out loud finally made it real. History often remembers monsters by name, but not the quiet accomplices who build the silence around them. Gertrude Benishevsky became infamous. The rest of the block disappeared into anonymity. Yet in the moral record of what happened, their absence is everywhere. Sylvia Likens died because of what was done to her, but she also died because of what wasn't done for her. In that distinction lies the tragedy of the neighborhood, the proof that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply hums behind closed doors while good people wait for someone else to listen. And when no one does, the silence grows until it sounds like normal life. When the news finally broke, it sounded like something that couldn't have happened in a living neighborhood. But long before the sirens came, the silence of East New York Street had already begun to crack. After the whispers stopped and the neighbors retreated into their safe routines, the Benishevsky house remained sealed from the world. Behind the drawn curtains, the last act of cruelty unfolded quietly. The air inside felt slower now, thick with exhaustion. The laughter was gone. Even the children sensed that something irreversible had happened, though none of them said it aloud. Gertrude's voice was no longer sharp. It was tired, rasping, as if the violence had drained her too. Yet she couldn't stop. To admit what she had done would be to face the truth she had built her life avoiding. So she told herself and everyone around her that the girl in the basement deserved it, that she had brought it on herself. It was a story she repeated until it sounded like fact. Downstairs, Sylvia Likens lay in the half. Time had stopped keeping meaning. She drifted between waking and fevered dreams, her thoughts flickering in and out like a candle struggling for air. Sometimes she imagined the sound of her mother's voice or the smell of popcorn from the state fair. Sometimes she only heard the echo of footsteps above her head. Jenny came when she could. She moved quietly, limping down the stairs with a cup of water or a torn blanket she had hidden under her shirt. The two sisters spoke little. The space between them was heavy with everything they couldn't change. On one of those nights, Sylvia reached for her hand and whispered, "Don't cry. Jenny, I think I'm going to die soon." Jenny tried to argue, but her voice broke halfway through the first word. The basement swallowed the sound. Sylvia's calm frightened her more than the bruises or the cold. It wasn't surrender, it was acceptance, the kind that comes when a person realizes that help will not arrive. In that moment, she wasn't begging anymore. She was trying to protect her sister from despair. Above them, Gertrude moved through the house like a ghost that refused to see itself. Paula pretended not to notice. The younger children played in silence, avoiding the basement door. Outside, autumn deepened. The wind scraped dry leaves against the siding, and the first hints of winter crept through the cracks. Gertrude had begun preparing her explanation weeks earlier. She told the children that if anything happened, they were to say Sylvia had run away, that she had been out of control and had come back sick. She rehearsed the story with a smoker's precision, editing the details until they sounded ordinary. The lie became another layer of insulation against guilt, but truth has a way of seeping through walls. On the night of October 25, 1965, the house was unnaturally still. No shouting, no footsteps, no laughter, only the ticking of a clock in the kitchen and the slow rhythm of Gertrude's cough. She lit one cigarette after another, staring at the floor as if waiting for something inevitable. Downstairs, Sylvia's breathing had grown shallow. Jenny sat beside her, counting each rise and fall as if willing them to continue. Once, Sylvia stirred and murmured a thank you for the water, a whisper so faint that Jenny almost thought she had imagined it. When morning came, sunlight slipped through the cracks in the boards, painting thin stripes across the cold floor. Sylvia didn't move. The world above carried on. Gertrude boiling coffee, a child looking for shoes, the mailman passing the gate until someone realized the girl below wasn't answering anymore. Gertrude sent one of the boys to check. A few seconds later, his footsteps thundered back up the stairs, and the words tumbled out in panic. The house erupted. Confusion, shouts, orders barked too late. For a moment, everyone spoke at once, and then there was only Gertrude's voice, low and trembling. "We have to call the police, not out of remorse, but out of necessity." The call came in at 6:30 p.m. 2 officers arrived expecting a routine report of a runaway found dead. They walked up the worn porch steps and were met by Gertrude herself, composed, rehearsed, holding a cigarette that trembled just enough to seem believable. She told them a story. The girl had been difficult, had run off with boys, had returned bruised and sick. They were caring for her when she collapsed. The officers followed her through the narrow hallway, past peeling wallpaper and the smell of stale smoke, to the basement door. When it opened, the air that rose up was heavy and cold. The first thing they noticed wasn't what they saw, but what they didn't. No sign of life, no sign of struggle, just the stillness of something long endured. One officer turned to ask a question, but before Gertrude could answer, a soft voice came from behind them. It was Jenny, standing at the edge of the stairs, her hands trembling. She looked at the floor, then at the men in uniform, and whispered, "Please, get me out of here. I'll tell you everything." That single sentence changed everything. Within minutes, the neat fiction Gertrude had built began to crumble. The officers separated the children, asked questions, took notes. Contradictions appeared instantly to many versions of the same lie. One child mentioned punishments, another mentioned the basement. When they questioned Jenny again, she spoke more clearly this time. The words spilled out, the beatings, the hunger, the weeks of silence. She didn't cry until she finished. The detectives who arrived later that night wrote in their report that the house felt charged, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Evidence was everywhere, the marks of confinement, the debris of neglect, the unmistakable residue of long suffering. One officer stepped outside for air and vomited in the yard. The other kept writing, his pen shaking. Gertrude Banaszewski was arrested that evening, still insisting that she had only disciplined a troubled girl. Paula followed soon after, along with several of the neighborhood children. The younger ones were taken to foster homes. For the first time, the street filled with noise that wasn't denial. Sirens, camera shutters, the low murmur of reporters gathering in the dusk. Neighbors stood behind fences, faces pale, watching the house they had spent months pretending not to see. The same woman who had almost called the police now whispered prayers. The same minister who had blessed the home wept silently beside his car. Jenny sat in the back seat of a patrol car, wrapped in a blanket too large for her. Through the window she could still see the front porch, the crooked railing, the place where her sister had once stood smiling. The officers promised she was safe now. She nodded, but safety felt like a foreign word something meant for other people. In the hours that followed, Indianapolis learned the truth piece by piece. The coroner's report spoke of exhaustion, infection, long neglect. Newspapers struggled for words strong enough to describe what had been allowed to happen. The headlines called it unimaginable, inhuman, the crime that shocked the nation. Yet for those who had lived on that block, the shock came with a deeper sting. They had all heard something. They had all chosen silence. Gertrude spent her first night in jail staring at the ceiling, asking for a cigarette. Paula wept once, briefly, then fell asleep. The other children whispered among themselves, trying to understand how play had turned into crime. Meanwhile, in a quiet room at the morgue, Sylvia's body was prepared for release. A small cross was placed near her, and the tag on her wrist read simply, Likens, Sylvia Marie, age 16. When her parents arrived from the carnival circuit days later, the police didn't know what to say. Betty Likens collapsed at the sight of the report. Lester stood motionless, his face drained of all color. For weeks afterward he would replay every letter, every delay in payment, every small decision that had led them to trust the wrong house. The funeral was simple. The casket was white, the flowers pale yellow, the church filled with people who promised they had cared. Outside, reporters waited. Inside, Jenny sat in the front row, staring at her sister's photograph. The last words Sylvia had said to her echoed over and over, "Don't cry." When the service ended, the pastor reminded everyone that faith required forgiveness. Jenny looked at the floor, wondering what forgiveness meant in a world where good people looked away. For Indianapolis, the story became legendary, told, analyzed, debated. Laws would change, agencies would be created, headlines would fade. But for those who had heard the screams and done nothing, the sound never left. It remained a quiet hum in the back of memory, a reminder of what silence costs. And for Sylvia Likens, whose kindness survived longer than her body, that hum was all that remained of her voice, a soft echo that still asks, decades later, if you hear someone suffering, will you stay silent too? The night the police carried Sylvia Likens' body from the basement, Indianapolis stopped pretending not to know. The flashing red and blue lights made every drawn curtain look guilty. Within hours, the story left East New York Street and spread across the state, across the country, carried by headlines that used words the city had never seen together before. Girl, tortured home neighbors. Reporters crowded the curb the next morning. What they found was not a mystery of a vanished child, but a mirror of what ordinary cruelty could become when no one interfered. The night the police carried Sylvia Likens' body from the basement, Indianapolis stopped pretending not to know. The flashing red and blue lights made every drawn curtain look guilty. Within hours, the story left East New York Street and spread across the state, across the country, carried by headlines that used words the city had never seen together before. Girl, tortured home neighbors. Reporters crowded the curb the next morning. What they found was not a mystery of a vanished child, but a mirror of what ordinary cruelty could become when no one interfered. The trial began in April 1966, 8 months after Sylvia's death. The courthouse was packed, everyday reporters in the front row, townspeople standing in the aisles, the air heavy with cigarettes and disbelief. Judge Saul Isaacs presided, his gavel barely able to contain the emotion that filled the room. At the defense table sat Gertrude, thin, pale, hands shaking slightly. She wore a simple gray dress and held a Bible that she rarely opened. To the public, she looked less like a monster than a tired woman, which somehow made everything worse. The prosecutor, Leroy New, opened with words that hung in the room like smoke. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about madness, it is about choice. For 3 months, the defendants chose to do nothing but evil, and the rest of us chose not to see. He laid out the timeline. The late payments, the punishments, the lies, the escalation. When he described the basement, the room went silent except for the scratching of pencils. Jenny Likens was the first to testify. 14 years old, slight, still walking with a limp, she spoke so softly the judge had to ask her to repeat herself. Her testimony took hours. She told the jury how she and Sylvia had been left in Gertrude's care, how the punishments began, and how she had whispered to the officers, "Please get me out of here. I'll tell you everything." Reporters later wrote that no one in the courtroom could meet her eyes when she finished. Next came the neighborhood children. Their stories, tangled by fear and guilt, painted a picture more chilling than any single account. Some admitted they had joined in because Mrs. Benishevsky said it was okay. Others cried, insisting they hadn't understood what they were doing. Each testimony deepened the horror, cruelty that had masqueraded as discipline, obedience mistaken for morality. When the coroner took the stand, his voice stayed measured, but the jurors looked away as he described the evidence of prolonged suffering. The defense objected twice, arguing that the details were prejudicial. The judge overruled both objections. Gertrude's lawyer built his case around 2 words: sickness and stress. He argued that her chronic illness, poverty, and the responsibility of 7 children had broken her mind. "She is not evil," he said. "She is unwell." Paula's defense claimed she had acted under her mother's influence, that she was a frightened girl, not a willing participant. The lawyers for the boys leaned heavily on youth, describing them as children who trusted an adult too much. But when prosecutors replayed their confessions matter of fact, emotionless, the courtroom stiffened. It was hard to hear and harder to excuse us for 17 days of testimony and 50 hours of deliberation. The jury returned. The room stood as the foreman read the verdicts one by one. Gertrude Benishevsky, guilty of first-degree murder. Paula Benishevsky, guilty of second-degree murder. Coy Hubbard. John Benishevsky, Richard Hobbs, guilty of manslaughter. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Gertrude sat motionless, eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Paula wept. Jenny, seated beside her parents, leaned against her father's arm but didn't cry. She had no tears left. The judge pronounced the sentences: Gertrude, life in prison. Paul, life reduced on appeal to second degree. The boys 2 to 21 years in the state reformatory. Justice, at least on paper, had been served. Outside, crowds applauded the verdicts, but the celebration was brief. Many wondered why the penalties for the teenagers were so light, why an entire neighborhood's silence could not be put on trial. The newspapers called it the most savage case in Indiana's history, and editorials demanded new laws to protect children left in foster care. Yet even as the city debated reform, time began to dull the outrage. New scandals filled the front pages, new wars, new tragedies. Gertrude appealed, claiming unfair publicity. Her conviction was upheld, but years later the case was retried. She was convicted again. This time her behavior in prison, quiet, compliant, polite, earned her the nickname Mother Gertie. God said she taught Bible study. In 1985, after serving 20 years, she was granted parole. The public protested, thousands signing petitions to keep her behind bars. But the law was the law. She walked out of prison at 60, moved under an assumed name to Iowa, and lived quietly until her death in 1990, when reporters found her years later. She refused interviews, saying only, "I'm not that person anymore." Paula, her daughter, served a shorter sentence and was released, marrying and moving away. The boys built ordinary lives, jobs, families, silence. None ever fully spoke of what happened in that house. Jenny Likens grew into adulthood carrying the memory like a scar. She testified at parole hearings, begged that Gertrude never be freed, and spent her life reminding anyone who would listen that her sister's name mattered more than her killers. The trial changed Indiana law. The state created new procedures for foster placement and child welfare checks. In classrooms, teachers were told to report unexplained injuries. The case became required reading in police academies. But the deeper lesson was harder to legislate. The court could convict individuals, not communities. It could punish cruelty, but not apathy. In the closing arguments, Prosecutor New had said, "This case is not just about one woman's sin, it is about the silence that let it grow." Years later, that line would be quoted in law journals, sermons, documentaries. But for the people who had lived on East New York Street, it remained personal, a quiet echo of everything they hadn't done in 1990. When news spread that Gertrude Benishevsky had died of lung cancer, some called it closure, others called it, the woman whose breath had once filled a house with smoke left the world the same way quietly, leaving ashes behind. Jenny, then in her 40s, refused to celebrate. She lived, she told a reporter, and that's more than Sylvia got. The house on East New York Street was eventually demolished. In its place stands a small lot, overgrown with weeds, unmarked by any sign. Yet those who know the story say that if you stand there at dusk, when the wind moves through the trees, you can almost hear the faint hum of traffic and the echo of a question that the trial never answered. How many people does it take to kill one girl? And how many will it take to make sure it never happens again? When the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded, Indianapolis tried to return to normal. The air grew quieter, the cameras disappeared, and people began speaking of the Likens case as if it were a terrible story from long ago, something safely sealed behind history. But for those who had seen the photographs, heard the testimony, or lived on East New York Street, the silence never returned the same. What remained was not just grief. It was reckoning. The death of Sylvia Likens forced America to look at itself in a way it rarely had before. The story was not about a stranger's violence, but about ordinary neglect and evil that could live quietly behind a neighbor's door. Newspapers called it the crime that made the whole state blush. Editorials asked how such suffering could happen for months, without a single voice raised to stop it. The shock was not only at what had been done, but at how many had seen and stayed silent. The case exposed a flaw larger than one family. It revealed the fragility of community, the ease with which responsibility dissolves when everyone assumes someone else will act. Politicians and social workers began to talk about reform, but beneath the official words lay a deeper unease. The realization that laws could not legislate compassion. In 1967, Indiana established stricter oversight for foster and boarding arrangements. Social service agencies were given authority to inspect homes unannounced. Teachers were required to report signs of neglect or abuse. Within a few years, similar laws spread across the country. The U.S. Congress began funding programs for child protection, and in 1974, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act was passed, laying the foundation for the system. Still in place today, it would be comforting to say these changes began purely out of moral awakening, but many who worked in the field admitted privately that Sylvia's name haunted every policy meeting. Her death had become a warning, proof that without oversight, kindness could no longer be trusted to survive on its own. Over the years, Sylvia's story found new forms: documentaries, books, lectures. In each retelling, The tone shifted from outrage to sorrow, from accusation to reflection. Historians called the case a turning point in America's understanding of domestic cruelty. Psychologists studied it as an example of group conformity, of how ordinary people commit extraordinary harm when guided by authority. But beyond academia, her name carried a quieter weight. In classrooms, teachers began to tell students, if you see something, say something. Churches used her story to preach empathy. For decades afterward, police recruits in Indiana learned the details, not just as evidence, but as caution. Still, time softened the edges. The children who had lived through the case grew old. The house was torn down. A small memorial plaque appeared years later, placed by volunteers who had never met her but refused to let her name disappear. It reads simply, Sylvia Likens, a child of Indiana. May her suffering awaken our compassion. What made the story unforgettable was not only its brutality, but its symbolism. Sylvia's death became a mirror held up to every community that values quiet over courage. She did not die because no one knew she died, because knowing was easier than acting. One journalist writing on the 20th anniversary put it best. Sylvia Likens did not die from blows alone. She died from the sound of doors closing. That sentence became a kind of epitaph for an entire generation. From then on, the Sylvia Likens case was no longer just a file in an archive. It was shorthand for the price of indifference. Her story appeared in lectures about ethics, in sermons about kindness, in training manuals for social workers and teachers. It reminded people that evil often looks ordinary, and that the most dangerous phrase in any neighborhood is "it's none of my business." For Jenny, Likens' life after the trial was a quiet act of survival. She married, moved away, and rarely spoke publicly, though she attended every parole hearing to make sure her sister's story was not rewritten. In her later years, she told a reporter, "Sylvia's gone, but what she stood for, what happened because of her, keeps her alive." Her words became a kind of mission statement for advocates nationwide. Jenny lived long enough to see social workers visit homes, teachers report abuse, and communities rally around children who once would have been invisible, and yet, she never called it justice, only progress. The courts had done what they could, convicted the guilty, changed the laws, corrected the paperwork, but the moral question remained larger. What does justice mean when it arrives too late? The Likens case became a lesson taught not through punishment but through conscience. Every person who read her story was forced to imagine the line between bystander and accomplice. It's a question that still lingers in every city, every neighborhood, when we hear suffering behind a wall, when we see a bruise, when we sense something is wrong. How many of us truly act? Because Sylvia's tragedy was never only about cruelty. It was about the quiet spaces where compassion should have lived. Decades later, when the house was gone and the street renamed, the memory of that 16-year-old girl still hovered in the Indiana air like unfinished music. Her name, once spoken in horror, now carried a kind of grace, an unspoken promise that the world had learned something from her suffering. Children today are safer because of the fear her story inspired, but fear alone isn't enough. What she deserves is empathy, the daily, deliberate act of caring before it's too late. If there is one truth left from her story, it is this. Sylvia Likens did not die simply because she was hurt. She died because the world around her stopped caring. And as long as her name is remembered, that silence will never fully return. The story of Sylvia Marie Likens ends not in the house where she died, but in the voices that still speak her name. She was 16, quiet, kind, unremarkable in the way ordinary goodness often is, and yet, in the years since her death, she has become something larger, a reminder that every scream unheard, every whisper ignored, can echo across generations. So tonight, if this story leaves you uneasy, let it, because unease means you still care, and caring, truly caring, is the only thing that ever changes the world. Listen when someone calls for help, because sometimes, silence kills too. In memory of Sylvia Marie Likens, 1949 to 1965. May her story remind us that compassion is not weakness, and that attention can be the difference between life and death. Thank you for staying with us through this story. If it moved you, if it made you think, or if you simply believe stories like Sylvia's should never be forgotten, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and help keep her memory alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss our next episode, where we explore the untold stories behind the quiet corners of history. This is Soul Speak, where stories aren't told just to be remembered, but to be understood.